ghosts, psychics, pendulums, curses, hexes. We welcome you here to Friday Night Dark in the realm of the night. Come join us and listen to this week's presentation, and we bid you welcome. Good evening. This is Drew, and I welcome you back to Friday Night Dark. Hey, tonight I'm going to be talking about telepathy. Telepathy itself is something where you're getting these feelings from someplace far away or about something. It can be in one direction or another. I'm bringing this up now. As I mentioned before, I've been starting to cover subjects a little bit more in depth, and telepathy kind of decided to jump in my face. So let's start first with the idea of what telepathy defines as. Telepathy, with its root words tele, meaning far, and pathos, meaning feeling. So, far feeling. That means that you're feeling something from far away. And in some cases, perhaps maybe you're sending those feelings far away. You send, receive, kind of like a telephone. But in either case, it does have other names: clairvoyance, foreknowledge, foresight, prescience, sixth sense, precognition, second sight, and can be considered an extrasensory perception. Now, telepathy is the idea that information can be transmitted or received from one person's mind to another without using physical interaction or known sensory channels. It's a type of, extrasensory perception. You know, the funny thing is that there was a conversation I had with someone one night, and it was a by chance thing where I was just happened to be on the phone, and this person, as I was waiting for an answer, was apparently there for the same reason I was, trying to get some help and whatnot, and I tried to think outside the box. And they were talking about this idea of what they called umwelten. Now that's basically something where you're only using the senses that you have to describe your environment around you. We have sight, smell, taste, hearing, and touch. And so they talked about how some creatures would define the world with things less than what we would have. So it was never a surprise, to them at least, that they would actually see something like, say, a starfish would traverse the bottom of an ocean and be able to determine what was food and what was just a rock. And they went about this a way that it not only convinced me, but then I asked them, I says, do you think there might be some kind of intuitive process to what they do? And they said, well, they don't really have a brain like we do, so we can't really map out their behavior, let alone our own. So it made me think a little bit about that whole process they mentioned. And then on top of that, maybe perhaps there is something like this sixth sense, or in the case of a starfish, a third sense. But while the existence of telepathy hasn't really been proven to one degree or another, there have been some research studies that have produced favorable results. For example, in one study, the sender concentrated on a card's face, and the receiver would try to guess the symbol. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen that movie, Ghostbusters. And, if you have, then you probably know where I'm going with that. You'll know that one of the protagonists of that movie, he kind of had things rigged. He knew what the cards were. And then on top of that, he would operate under the premise of, that this is something where you're going to get, you're going to get more psychic impressions the more under duress you are. And so it was just one of those things where he took pleasure in shocking people. Now, you're probably wondering, where am I going with that? Well, in some instances, there are some people who actually have gone through studies similar to that one. And the scores themselves, in some cases, are significantly above chance. Some are not. They're less than that. But in some cases, success sometimes isn't necessarily something where you have to have 100% right. Folks that might be in the range of, say, 80%, if there was 100 cards, that means 80 of them would be correct. That person would be considered psychic or had some form of telepathy. But these days, I know that some of these testing methods they have are a little bit more rigorous. But does telepathy really exist? Well, the thing that's interesting about it is that it's been talked about in lore and in science fiction and fantasy novels for a very long time. But yet there are some things outside of the human existence that have proven that there might be some semblance to telepathy. Example. Well, when termites start making a hive, sometimes they'll start constructing things, and one might go off in one direction and one might go off in another. And at some point, all of a sudden, one of them will go over and join the other, and they just start making this one portion of their hive to build up and do whatever they had to do. What made them change their mind? There was no communication that we saw openly, correct? Well, the idea is that they're working towards a higher purpose, but with no idea as to why for the individual. But what if there was some kind of telepathy? Was it communication between the two that were helping to build the hive? Or was there a higher purpose, a higher mind? Oh wait, they do have a queen that they serve, right? Maybe it came from them. And so perhaps this is how the idea may have come about. It doesn't completely prove the idea, but it does give the concept of what it might look like if it was effectively used for communication, right? Now, people ask, can you train for this, or is it just chance? Well, I would like to say that there have been projects, ones that well known, and I've touched on it several times, and that's with the CIA and their Stargate project, or Project Stargate, or I forget which way it went. But in some cases, although it started somewhere in the 70s, it ended somewhere in the mid-90s, and they proved that there was some things that they were able to do, but not everything that they wanted to do. So, is it really chance? I couldn't tell you that. I'll let you be the judge. But how many times have you talked with married couples that one would start a sentence and one would finish it? That one would do things and then all of a sudden the other would kind of know. I've seen many stories and allegories from folks that talk about this type of an issue, and in a lot of cases it's considered a form of telepathy, but perhaps maybe it's a form of familiarity of the person that they're speaking of or speaking for. And although it's not necessarily something 100% correct or proven, it does bring about the idea that maybe this telepathy might be real. There might be some truth to what it looks like, and it may not necessarily be the way that we think. Just saying. But who knows how to make it happen? There have been all kinds of things, from like a form of meditation to some kind of hypnagogic state, hypnosis, possibly even some kind of an idea that it's a state of trance that one needs to be in, that this has to take place, that they're able to receive or send these messages. Some people might get a bunch of rocks or crystals, and they might start trying to use things. Now, there's something about that, because crystals themselves have been used in things like radios to transmit and receive messages. They've been used in watches to store information. They've been used to amplify signals to go out to wherever. They've been used to focus on certain things. Lasers sometimes use a form of crystal to focus on a specific spot. So, can it happen? It's quite possible. Now, I'm not saying to go out and buy a crystal and try to use telepathy. Just the opposite. I want you to take a look at some examples of people used in the past to try to explain and prove that telepathy does exist. And for the most part, I know there's a lot of folks out there that will tell you, it's a lot of baloney. Is it? There have been several instances where folks on one side of the country would have some kind of an issue going on, and someone on the other side would kind of feel up distress. And then they would call that person and say, "Hey, are you all right?" Let me give you an instance of something like this. A while back, I was talking with someone who was laid up in a hospital. When I was talking with them, they were talking about their whole experience, that they happened to just be there, and they had, for whatever reason, a freak accident, and something flew up into their face, and it literally dug itself into their cheek and into part of their eye. And so they managed to survive the whole incident, went straight to the ER, and of course they had to have everything surgically removed. Now, so far this seems pretty horrid, but nothing out of the ordinary, right? Well, this is where his story took a turn for the worst, or should I say for the more interesting part. He said that after that happened, he was in the ER, he hadn't called anybody, and there was people that were like looking for him, and the law enforcement people and the first responders on the scene took a phone number down and called and said, "Yeah, we just want to let you know," and they were interrupted by the person's mom, who said, "He's in the hospital. Which one is he at?" And they said, "How did you know?" "I just been here thinking that there was something wrong, and I just been looking for him, and I've got friends looking." And as soon as they hung up from that person, knowing where they were at, they got phone calls from other people that said, "Hey, it looks like he's at this hospital, and he was in this car accident." And so they went on to talk about some other things, and they made arrangements to get out there and do what they had to. They contacted the spouse, who, by the way, had also had a very worried feeling that something was wrong, but they couldn't figure out what it was. They contacted their own parents and said, "I have a feeling something's happened." And they said, "Well, he's late. It could be anything, right?" And they're like, "Well, no, that's not what I'm getting at. Is that there's something wrong." And more on that guy in just a little bit. But the point of the matter is that it seems that if you're ever under any kind of duress, these kind of feelings can and could be transmitted. But does it have to be something stressful? In some cases, there might be things that are going on that might be very happy. Someone might have won the jackpot, and in some instances, there was one story I read about where they were in Vegas, they hit the jackpot, and almost immediately, the person's girlfriend came out of nowhere and says, "You won, you won, you won." And he didn't know where they came from. Accused her of watching him, and she said, "No, I didn't watch you. I just knew something was happening, and it was a great thing. And I found you, and here you are, and you've got a jackpot." That one remains to be seen, I think. But it does make me wonder if there is some emotion behind it, like the primer in a bullet, that some emotional outburst takes place, and then all of a sudden, boom, it sends this message to whoever happens to be at the forefront, or possibly even the back of your mind. It could be the loved one, it could be family, it could be close friends. And there is a test that you can do where you can ask close friends if what you sense they are feeling what they're actually feeling. The way that normally happens is that you play this game where every so often you pick up the phone and you ask something like, "Hey, what are you doing at this moment? I have a feeling you're doing X, Y, or Z." And there are tests along the same guidelines when someone starts to look at scopesthesia, which I've mentioned last year, where you have that feeling of being watched. So, of course, it would go without saying that this is kind of that same kind of idea of telepathy, where you might be transmitting a more predatory idea. And so the question comes, does it have to be something malicious? Can it be something that is, a good feeling? I would happen to think so, because there are folks that say that they can feel when something is going on, when they have that oxytocin feeling, like from hugging somebody or, being at some good event, and something good is about to happen. You fill in the blank what that could be. Do you think that that could happen? Maybe, maybe not. But how many times have you ever seen where somebody, like a couple, might walk in and it's Christmas time and everyone's happy, and you already know before they announce that they're going to get married? Maybe it's the expression on their face. Maybe it's the way they came in. But you somehow knew what was going to be said next. Or perhaps maybe you might see that there's two people and they're obviously making a connection, and you can see it on their face perhaps, or maybe you just got that feeling from both of them. Does that make you telepathic or just very observant? And that's where the argument comes in. There are a lot of tests that folks have undergone, and there's not been very much accuracy, and consequently there have been tests that have been done and just the opposite takes place. Remember that telephone game? I know that there's another one with email where every 4 hours you would have to guess who might be sending you an email. And if it shows up, boom, there it is. You're like, hey, yeah, I was just thinking about you and you just sent me an email. That's great. Thanks, There is a long distance experiment where you check in with others to see if you can feel what they are feeling. And that's that telephone game I was talking about. There was an online test that you can take. Participants guess which of the four senders, in some instances, 2 virtual and 2 actual, might be sending a message. And in one study, the hit rate was something like 26%, which is slightly higher than 25. Now, that means that in most cases, you have a 1 in 4 chance of actually picking which one was sending you a message and which one wasn't. But if you picked right more than once on somebody, then obviously that meant that you were probably, getting something. As to what, that still remains a question. But there was this one thing, what do they call it? The Gansfield experiment. And one person is cut off from visual stimulation for several minutes while another person tries to send them information through the mind. Sometimes people who try this experiment end up having hallucinations. And I know in some cases, this borderlines on some of that idea of lucid dreaming. And it does go back to that CIA project I was talking about, where in some cases they were trying to derive visions and or ideas by some kind of telepathic relay. They were just trying to get that information out of somebody or send it and have them do something. And then they would either get the compulsion to call or check in, or they were trying to find someone. It's one of those things where you have to ask yourself, could this really happen? And despite the decades of research for that, there doesn't seem to be any credible scientific evidence that telepathy is real. But there are those behavioral and genetic factors that might explain why identical twins have some kind of telepathic connection, or for that matter, like you have close-knit families that they all tend to know, or husband and wife teams. And this has gone on through the ages. So I'm going to throw this other thing out there, is that although I know some folks would say that, well, we can't prove it, but yet there are things that say that it might be, possible. And I would tend to agree with that. Do you remember that whole thing with AI that's been going around these last few years, and people have been saying, oh, it's dangerous? Well, maybe, maybe not. I keep thinking of that movie Terminator. And if you remember the character that told everyone about, hey, if we do this, then this is what happens. And they go about trying to stop the creation of the Terminator. And in some ways, they probably ended up creating that very thing or a variation of that same future. And it goes back to the idea that maybe time travel could be part of it. Don't know. But then the AI aspect did make me raise an eyebrow way back when about it. You see, artificial intelligence, or AI, is software driven right now. But there was a point where people were thinking that artificial intelligence wouldn't be complete unless it had a computing half to the software that was running it. So, of course, if you know where I'm headed, just give me a second. Alan Turing wrote a paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, and he introduces what is now known as the Turing test. Okay, now the Turing test itself is a list of questions that would help to elicit responses that were for more current events and things. But at one point, it also requires a little bit of guesswork. So you're going to have to trust your gut, your intuition. Now, if you know where I'm going with that, the intuition is that form of telepathy that folks have. Talk to any good detective out there. Read a good detective novel, and they have a hunch. They're trusting their gut. They got a gut feeling. You fill in the blank, whatever it is. Guess what? Intuition, telepathy. You see where I'm going with that? Well, it shouldn't surprise you then that you have someone like Alan Turing who actually had talked about telepathy as being part of the test. And the one thing he does say, and I'm going to say it as follows: the argument from extrasensory perception or telepathy is something that I assume, as he says, the reader is familiar with, and the idea of extrasensory perception, still meaning telepathy. And the meaning of the 4 items of IT, VIZ, telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and psychokinesis. These disturbing phenomena may seem to deny all our usual scientific ideas. Now, he goes on to say that, we should discredit and make sure that this stuff isn't completely real. But if there's any chance for existence of that, then maybe perhaps we have to look at that as a way of a computer to be able to be completely and totally artificially intelligent by that particular type of phraseology, if you will. Now, he goes on to say that, it's difficult to rearrange one's ideas so as to fit the new facts, but he also mentions that if you accept the idea that there is such thing as ghosts, then perhaps it might also tend to think that maybe the idea of psychic thought and telepathy itself might be something that would be generated even in an artificial intelligence type of a situation. Now that should spook you more than it should spook me. But at the same time, I'd also say maybe that's one of the things that's missing in all these Turing tests that everyone keeps talking about with AI software. Maybe it's not the computer and the processor, maybe it's not the software, but perhaps the soul itself, a soul inside the machine that needs to be discovered. Why am I saying all this? Well, put bluntly, if you want to prove telepathy, and if you were to do this from folks who make a living out of debunking the very concept, then we would have to actually visit electronic devices that could emulate human thought to the point where there would be that hunch that would have to take place. I mean, really honestly. But the problem is that we haven't got to that point. We've got software that seems to be doing the trick to a certain point, but it's another type of test. They call it, a mirror test, where you're sitting there and you're kind of like, putting your hand in front of a mirror, and it emulates everything that you're doing. And no matter how hard you try, you can't trick the reflection in the mirror to do something different. Right? I know that goes into a whole new subject for another time, but it goes back to what I was saying before. I've addressed AI software, and I talked specifically about how you might be able to create AI to do something as meaningful as a seance. And in that instance, I even joked about the idea that maybe you walk into a place in Las Vegas for a psychic or a medium type reading, and instead of an actual person with one of those stereotypical Swami hats with the moon and the cape and the glitter, you find a computer. And here again, you have that kind of an idea that even the author of the Turing test himself had said, hey, we've got to get past the idea of there being psychics and telepathy before we can actually prove that a computer can become as sentient as we are. And so there's no scientific evidence that can prove that yet, but at the same time, there are some ideas that this can actually take place. Now, I know I've digressed quite a bit, but for good reason, is that you have a situation where perhaps telepathy could exist, and if a computer can touch on it somehow, or some way uncannily predict things, does that mean that it has some kind of intuitive sense to it? Perhaps maybe we've already touched on this idea and proven that telepathy does exist. Let's take a look at some of that stock trading programs that are AI driven out there that somehow manage to predict when certain things are ready to buy and when you're ready to sell. There's a guy out there on TikTok who actually is, I see all the time, who's selling the software. And he says he makes $2,000 and $3,000 a day on predictable and reproducible type of situation where he's making his money. So if he's able to do that with AI software, is that making the software psychic? Or is it just knowing what the fingerprints are to predict it? Go back to that AI software with the seance. And you have to wonder if perhaps maybe it has to draw off of whatever fingerprints that it gets to be able to determine and answer as if it was the person you're trying to contact. Does that make it a psychic program? I'm not sure, but you can kind of see where I'm going. Telepathy in itself, I know, has a lot of different things. As I mentioned before, there were people that did what was it called? The Gansfield experiment, and they were getting hallucinations. And they were in fact seeing things that may not have been completely on subject, but might have been somewhat receiving something from the future. And they have this idea that something else is going to happen or is just around the corner. I have a friend that he talked to me in confidence. And he said that his family was always plagued with like these, what he called short-term visions. He called them around the bends. And basically that he would know if something was going to be just around the corner, but it was just enough that he could change his mind and go the other way. Or in some instances, it might be the one thing where he chooses to ignore it more often than not, and he finds out that he should have listened to his intuition. And I know there's a lot of people out there that might be shaking their head and saying, oh yeah, I've had that experience so many times and I kicked myself. Listen to that comment that you might be making, or even if you make that acknowledgement, you're going to know. Telepathy might actually touch on something that we're thinking at a more higher level of debate. And there have been many people who've said that a lot of our decision making is actually debated at the subconscious level. So then, is our own mind making these decisions that seem intuitive? Or perhaps maybe we're just perceptive enough to know that, hey, we might be walking into something just around the bend, as my friend put it. I couldn't tell you, but it does entertain that if telepathy isn't real, then there's a lot of portents that show that there could be a way to obtain that kind of thinking. And yet, at the same time, if telepathy is real, what makes it so it only works once in a while? Is there a primer that needs to be in place? Is there some kind of gunpowder that needs to help shoot this off and get in that direction or state of mind where you're sending or receiving these thoughts? Remember earlier when I talked about the trauma that one person had, and that people knew him, who knew him, were receiving these ideas, he was in trouble. Consequently, there were people that might have come and thought, hey, something must be going on. I got to go see what's going on and find out this person won a jackpot. Does it truly mean that it's only going to be bad ideas? How about those people who know when they're being watched? Are they somehow proving that this telepathy might actually be somewhat real? These are all things that I think need to be considered if you want to try to prove or disprove telepathy. I am talking about it from a certain point of view, and that is, I'm just discussing the idea of its existence. I tend to think that perhaps there might be both. I think it is something that does exist, but perhaps it's not in the way we think. But what do you think? Do you think that telepathy is something that could be learned or trained? Do you think it's for real? Well, when you're after this whole program, you decide to start talking about it, maybe you might start talking about it with me. Where else? Friday Night Dark at nighttracks.com. Hey, this is Drew, and I bid you good night.
Thanks for listening to Friday Night Dark. Coffee is one of those items you drink in the morning. With dessert. Perhaps whenever it's late. Or maybe even when it's a long day or night. Try Coffee USA for all your coffee supplies and needs. If you follow our link down below, you can enter a code at checkout. Friday Night Dark. Then when you make your purchase, you will get an extra 10% off. Come give it a try and see for yourself. Thanks for looking and thanks for listening to us here. Nighttracks.com.